Welcome to the Altruistic Libertarian, advocate for a genuinely free society. I'm Anthony Wheeler, and today we review more bad business, beginning with a focus on Social Security, and in following episodes, public education and the United States Postal Service. Transportation is just one of several industries that the U.S. government has owned, managed, regulated, or otherwise distorted. While the damages for each intervention are specific in each case, in no instance does the benefit of intervention outweigh the significant costs. In other words, the government has no business being in business. Social Security. The Social Security program has been on unstable theoretical grounds since its inception and unstable economic grounds for the past several decades. Privately funded retirement programs, unlike Social Security, invest a portion of the person's income into financial instruments that will generate a return. This return represents genuine economic creation, wealth that didn't exist when the funds were originally invested. Once a person retires, these funds, usually enhanced if properly invested, are drawn down as necessary. No additional input is required. Alternatively, Social Security simply transfers funds from one person to another at some additional administrative cost without making any investment. Quote, "If the government uses the sums borrowed for investment in those lines in which they best serve the wants of consumers, and if it succeeds in these entrepreneurial activities in free and equal competition with all private entrepreneurs, it is in the same position as in any other businessman. It can pay interest because it has made surpluses. But if the government invests funds unsuccessfully and no surplus results, or if it spends the money for current expenditure, the capital borrowed shrinks or disappears entirely, and no source is open from which interest and principal could be paid." Unquote. For all the funds that pass through Social Security, no option for investment exists. It is simply consumed. This direct transfer in Social Security is known by another name. Quote, "A Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent investing scam promising high rates of return with little risk to investors. The Ponzi scheme generates returns for older investors by acquiring new investors. This is similar to a pyramid scheme in that both are based on using new investors' funds to pay the earlier backers. For both Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes, eventually there isn't enough money to go around and the scheme unravels." Unquote. Social Security fits this definition perfectly. An early case demonstrates how original recipients benefited to the detriment of future ones. Quote, "Ida Mae Fuller worked for 3 years under the Social Security program. The accumulated taxes on her salary during those 3 years was a total of $22.75. Her initial monthly check was $22.54. During her lifetime, she collected a total of $22,888.92 in Social Security benefits." Unquote. Today's taxpayers continue to fund current beneficiaries. A Social Security Administration publication states, and I quote, "The money you pay in taxes is not held in a personal account for you to use when you get benefits. Your taxes are being used right now to pay people who are getting benefits. Any unused money goes to the Social Security trust funds, not a personal account with your name on it." Unquote. The only difference between a typical Ponzi schemes and Social Security is that the private fraud always ends, whereas Social Security continues, dependent as it is on increased taxes, lower benefits, or an infusion of funds from other tax sources. The Clinton administration's 2000 budget proposal states that the Social Security Trust Fund does, and I quote, "not consist of real economic assets that can be drawn down in the future to pay fund benefits. Instead, they are claims on the Treasury that, when redeemed, will have to be financed by raising taxes, borrowing from the public, or reducing benefits or other expenditures." Unquote. Changes had to be made in 1983 in order to keep the program propped up, and I quote, "There was nothing more explosive than Social Security reform. Everybody knew that no matter how you dressed it up, any solution was in the end going to involve either raising taxes or cutting benefits for a huge and powerful block of voters, or both. The plan signed into law in 1983 involved paying for everyone, Employers had to absorb further increases in the payroll tax. Employees faced higher taxes too, and in some cases saw the date when they could anticipate receiving benefits pushed further into the future. Retirees had to accept postponement of cost of living increases, and wealthier retirees began having their benefits taxed. But by doing all this, we succeeded in funding Social Security for the 75-year planning period that is conventional for social insurance programs. Moynihan, with his usual eloquence, declared, "I have the strongest feeling that we all have won." What we have won is a resolution of the terrible fear in this country that the Social Security system was, like a chain letter, something of a fraud. Unquote. The crisis was simply put off for another day. The following news item indicates the inevitable state of such a scheme, whether it be interim, you need more money, or terminal, it comes crashing down. The word permanently in the last line is inordinately optimistic. And I quote from September 24, 2007. The Bush administration said in a new report Monday that Social Security is facing a $13.6 trillion shortfall and that delaying needed reforms is not fair to younger workers. A report issued by the Treasury Department said that some combination of benefit cuts and tax increases will need to be considered to permanently fix the funding shortfall. Unquote. As of today, quote, all taxes that have been paid in the Social Security system since its inception have already been 1. Spent to pay for benefits, 2. Spent to fund the administrative overhead of the program, or 3. Loaned to the federal government. Unquote. In the early years of Social Security, it was asserted that the program would self-fund indefinitely. At the outset of the Social Security program, the federal government published an informational pamphlet that stated the following about Social Security taxes. And I quote, "And finally, beginning in 1949, 12 years from now, you and your employer will each pay 3 cents on each dollar you earn up to $3,000 a year. That is the most you will ever pay." Accounting for inflation, this promise equates to a maximum tax collection of $1,802 per person. For 2014, the maximum payroll tax collection per person is $14,508, or 8 times the promised maximum. Unquote. As can be seen in this chart, steady increases in tax rates have regularly occurred. The program has also been burdened by increasing recipients relative to working taxpayers. In 1955, there were 8 workers for each retiree on benefits. In 2015, that was down to 3 to 1, trending towards 2 to 1. 2 workers for each person on benefits. The recent history of Social Security and the foreseeable future indicate the magnitude of the crisis. Quote, from 1985 through 2009, Social Security's dedicated taxes exceeded its expenses. In 2010, the situation reversed, and expenses exceeded dedicated taxes. This state of affairs continued through 2013 and is projected to continue every year in the foreseeable future. Despite the interest payments that Social Security receives on the trust fund began declining in value in 2011, which is 8 years earlier than the Social Security Administration projected in 2011 and 10 years earlier than they projected in 2010. The Social Security Trust Fund continued declining in 2012 and 2013, and the state of affairs is projected to continue until the trust fund is exhausted in 2033. After 2033, Social Security is projected to run deficits every year into the foreseeable future. To cover these deficits, it is projected that payroll taxes would need to be increased by 31% starting in 2033, rising to a 40% increase in 2088. These shortfalls could also be covered by reducing benefits by 23% starting in 2033, rising to a 27% reduction by 2088. Unquote. The Social Security Trust Fund is a misnomer. There is no trust and no funds, as any surpluses in the program are immediately loaned to the federal government. Quote, when the Social Security program loans money to the U.S. government, the government is obligated by law to pay the money back to the Social Security program with interest. This money becomes part of the national debt. When the Social Security program loans money to the U.S. government, the government can use this money to pay down the debt that it owes to other entities. This leaves the national debt unchanged because the government must still pay back this money to the Social Security program. Some politicians have referred to this action as putting Social Security in a lockbox. When the Social Security program loans money to the U.S. government, the government can also spend the money on other government programs. This increases the national debt because the government has spent the money it has borrowed from Social Security. Some politicians have referred to this action as raiding the Social Security Trust Fund. As of December 31, 2013, the U.S. government owes $2.765 trillion to the Social Security Trust Fund. This equates to $8,715 for every man, woman, and child living in the United States and over $22,000 per household. The Social Security program started drawing money from the trust fund in 2010 and is projected to keep drawing this money every year until the trust fund is exhausted in 2033. Unquote. No matter what happens, significant change is inevitable. Some combination of higher payroll taxes, a reduction in benefits, or an increase in the retirement age will be required, ensuring that Social Security will not be the same in the coming decades. Perhaps most likely, the government will simply fund Social Security with newly printed money after capping annual cost of living increases. The ensuing inflation will decrease real benefits without having to legislate lower dollar amounts, minimize political repercussions. For those who believe future benefits levels are safe, that they are owed some kind of guarantee, are sorely mistaken. The website of the United States Social Security Administration states, and I quote, "There has been a temptation throughout the program's history for some people to suppose that their FICA payroll taxes entitle them to a benefit in a legal contractual sense. Congress clearly had no such limitation in mind when crafting the law. Benefits which are granted at one time can be withdrawn." Unquote. The only way to get the program on sustainable terms is to privatize it, or better yet, eliminate it altogether. The dam principle. Many changes that are required to realize a genuinely free society will take time to implement. Transitions may take years, decades even. When the government institutes a new policy that changes how people live, it's like they build a dam that restricts the flow of that particular stream. As time goes by, water builds behind that dam and forms a reservoir. Like Social Security, when people come to depend on monthly checks they never had before. Over time, the dependence grows as the reservoir does behind the dam. Given the magnitude of the reservoir, that is, growing dependence on a particular government program, making major changes suddenly may cause much damage, not unlike releasing an entire lake's worth of water behind a dam all at once, flooding homes, golf courses, and shopping malls. Instead, the lake must be drained slowly until very little water is held back by the dam, at which point the artificial impediment can be completely and safely removed. Social Security serves as a good example. While such a program wouldn't exist within a genuinely free society, simply shutting down the Social Security Administration and eliminating both taxes and the payments would have a devastating effect on millions of people. Thousands would lose their jobs without warning, and countless people dependent on Social Security benefits would be left without adequate resources. Properly dismantling Social Security may take decades, perhaps 2 or 3 generations. Doing so, however, would contribute significantly to the wealth of the nation, the material improvement of virtually every citizen, and particularly our grandchildren. Quote, "If one wants to harvest quickly, one must plant carrots and salads. If one has the ambition to plant oaks, one must have the sense to tell oneself, 'My grandchildren will owe me this shade.'" Unquote. The sooner we plant the Social Security acorn, the sooner our progeny will enjoy the ensuing shade. The Social Security scheme is ripe for collapse, poses a constant burden to the nation's economy, and maintains a financial trap for the elderly. It's past time for radical change. Well, that concludes our show for today. In the next episode, we take a look at more bad business, specifically public education. Until then, peace.